Welcome. Once again, the Southgate Women's Group is offering you this series of forums for Palo Alto City Council candidates. Tonight's guest is Ajit Varma. And without further ado, please welcome our moderator, Jeanette Kiesling.
I don't hear the applause, Rita. Yay.
Oh, Judith just applauding for you.
Okay, you're going to hand over to me. Thank you so much, Rita.
That's it.
Okay, awesome. Short, sweet, and short. We're short and sweet. Welcome from my side. Welcome to all the participants who came out tonight. And special welcome to Ajit Varma, who is our guest tonight, who is running for City Council and who's here to tell us about who he is, why he wants to run for City Council, and what his policies are. Just a little bit about the forum. As we've done in the last forums, we have a very short introduction of our guest, and then I'll hand over to you, Ajit, for more explanation about the things I just talked about, namely your positions and more you would like to offer us about yourself. So let me start by saying that you came here from Austin, Texas in 1999. So you've lived in Palo Alto a good 20 years. You are, if I may say so, I call my husband that, so I guess I can. You are a real techie. You worked in tech and you were attracted by the Silicon Valley flair and its innovative spirit. You worked in several positions in tech, mostly in product management, and you're currently working for WhatsApp. I use that all the time to communicate with Europe. So technically you're a Facebook employee.
Right.
So you are saying about yourself that you're not a politician, which is very interesting and refreshing. So we hope to get a lot more answers out of you than some other candidates. But you feel that your experience to find new solutions to new problems, the things that you do every day in your job, qualify you for becoming a city council member. Mm. And this is what I would like you to focus a little bit more about in the next 5 to 10 minutes to tell us why you would like to bring in your expertise to City Council.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for your time and the opportunity to talk to you. So I just touch on some of the points that you mentioned in my background a little bit more as I sort of just go into why I'm interested in serving you on City Council. So as you mentioned, I came out to Palo Alto because it was the center of Silicon Valley. At the time I came out here, I didn't actually know much about Palo Alto, but I knew that this is where people came if they really thought that technology was a way to help the world and build better things for people. So I do believe that this is kind of a unique spot that we have. And so when you look back 20 years ago, I think that it was very clear that this was the place that you came to opportunity. And I think that you could start from anywhere and have an impact and create great things here. But over the last 20 years, and I'd say especially over the last 10 years, I think that as I've seen people try to come here, it's just been more and more difficult. And part of this is just that the cost of living has just increased pretty exponentially over that time. But it's also that the policies that are there as a city in terms of allowing growth and not being, I'd say, obstructionistic in terms of creating some of the things that make this possible, like say mixed use or denser development, is something that has turned it into, I'd say, an area that a lot of people that I just know personally, were living here, but then when they ultimately decided to have a family or wanted to buy a house or settle down, they made decisions to leave the area. And so just going to that thread, and then I'll come back to some of the things that I've done where I think that I have some, I'd say a unique background in order to help the city, is that's ultimately the kernel of why I want to really help the city. And so I believe that it's likely that in the next 10 years, Palo Alto won't have its same place in the world that it has historically had. And by that, it's a trend that I think has been happening for a little while now, where people come here, they work here for a few years, and they ultimately make a decision to go somewhere else because they can't afford it, or they live in places that are farther away. Or if you look at a lot of companies that have started in Palo Alto, they ultimately made the decision to leave Palo Alto because it just wasn't conducive to supporting the needs of their employees and themselves. But with COVID, that really accelerated, where companies sort of shifted their philosophy from working in a sort of collegiate environment with each other, brainstorming, to saying that, okay, the benefits of that, given the cost of living in Palo Alto and the surrounding areas, isn't worth it. And so they offered many employees the ability to work remotely. And so at least for my company, 40% of people said that they would prefer to leave the state and work from home. And to me, like, that's like a pretty unfortunate thing, because I believe that a lot of these people have like great ideas and bring in like an innovative mindset that allowed us to create companies like Tesla, Google, that are having, I think, really positive benefits, and also benefit from like being in close proximity to like Stanford and having this culture of like innovation and risk taking that I think a lot of other places don't have. So that's like the thing is, with COVID, I sort of really am worried that this is an event that we will not be able to recover from and sort of regain our sort of like stature and sort of our place in the world. And that goes to everything from like, well, small businesses are closing. If you look on University Avenue, if you look on El Camino, there's just like tons of like for lease signs. When I've talked to a lot of small businesses that have been here, they sort of like told me that it was very difficult for them to actually get up and running in Palo Alto, because if you want to change the use of any building, if you want to get support, if you want to pay like license fees, there's just a lot of obstacles to be able to run your business here. And so I think these small businesses are very important to our culture. There's also like large businesses that are growing and just making announcements that they're not going to grow as much in Silicon Valley and pursue growth elsewhere. I think that that's a negative for the area, because I think what ends up happening, from what I can tell, is executives at these companies who are very wealthy, or who have already made their like money and like bought housing, like those are the only people who are going to be left in Palo Alto. And then also, if you build just like this sort of culture, I sort of think is like very negative. Of you then have like the people who are working in the community living far away. You don't have a middle class in Palo Alto. It just like changes like the culture of the city. And I think like it's important to have a diverse like set of backgrounds. It shouldn't be just tech people. It should be sort of accommodating and attracting people from like all backgrounds at all income levels and different backgrounds. And also, it's like people who come here should come here and say, okay, this is a great place where I can have an impact. So this is kind of like what sort of made me really start thinking about running about 6 months ago. And then more recently, I've been talking to a lot of like the city council candidates, as well, like incumbents, as well as people who have declared that they're running. And I think that you have a lot of candidates who are very much in either the no growth mindset, or very much in the only create below market housing, and then we're going to tax like businesses and residents in order to support that. But I really feel like that these are things that have been tried before, and we haven't solved a lot of our systemic problems here. And so I really think that you have to come at it from a more of like I wouldn't say an engineering background, but more of like a background of like, well, how is this going to actually be funded? Like, how are we going to support this? And I think with that is like, you have to support companies. And with companies, like you can get sort of this mixed use sort of situation where you say, okay, in return for us giving you these concessions, we'll allow you to build much more like we'll allow you to build this in return for housing, in return for public benefits. And this has like happened, but it hasn't happened successfully with things like Edgewood Market, like other marketplaces, where I think that you can do a lot more to like encourage public benefits and housing benefits in return for other things. So that's like where I really want to like push on, like, how do we like solve these problems that have been lingering for a while. So in terms of like my background, it's been mostly focused on like technology. So it has been like creating new products. It's like been more creating new solutions. So I think this is like a different background. There are a couple of engineers on like city council, but I think that it's more like distant engineering work. And so I want to like just bring a different perspective as well, to represent all the people on in Palo Alto. So it's kind of just like a quick overview, but happy to go into more detail in any areas in particular.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for this first introduction. I'd like to stay in the housing questions,
Sure.
with the housing questions. Two things about that. Did I understand this right? That you are saying your competitors have a no growth mindset, and that you are then logically saying on the other side, you would actually
Yes.
have a growth mindset. So
Correct.
you'd like Palo Alto to grow.
Correct.
And if so, you already said yes. How exactly would you go about doing this?
Sure.
You were saying what you would like to
Yeah.
do, but how would you do it?
Yeah, so a few things. So one is I definitely think that there are corridors in areas of Palo Alto that can support denser development. And so those areas that I think are basically around El Camino, you have a lot of like older buildings, dilapidated motels that I think can support denser development. You see denser development happening just on the borders of Palo Alto as well. So like Menlo Park is supporting denser development on El Camino, as is Mountain View. There's also the ability to do bus routes and public transportation on El Camino as well. Also, I think Sand Hill Road, Page Mill Road, parts of San Antonio Road, east of 101 on Embarcadero Road, where the Bayshore is. A lot of areas near 101, I think, are supportive of more development. And so in terms of like development, I think that density means that it'd be an increase of the height limit. I think that for a lot of these things, like you need to work with private companies and create economically feasible ways to create that denser development. And the way that I think that work is like if you look at Google and Mountain View and Facebook in Menlo Park, is they are creating mixed use facilities. And when you think about like the ratio, I think there's a lot of people like you can't have more office development. Like that's the source of a lot of our problem. But because land is like so valuable in Palo Alto, I think there's a lot you can do to like say that the benefits of allowing companies to do that outweigh and like overextend like the amount of jobs there are. So you say like, well, if one job is created, then can you force companies to create 2 housing units? And most companies are already committed to building housing. So Google's announced $1 billion plan to build housing in the Bay Area. And I think that it is an opportunity to get some of that housing created in areas as well. I think also there's a question around like the height limit. So I think there's a 50-foot height limit. They can be extended in certain areas, definitely not all areas. Like I do believe that residential areas are very important to Palo Alto, but I think that in these right areas, in additional areas, sort of things like University Avenue near the Caltrain station, California Avenue, also you can support more density. Also with mixed use, I think it's important for people to be encouraged to live and work in close proximity so that they don't create more traffic. And so I think with that, you also can say that do we need our parking requirements of like 0.7 parking spots per person in terms of creating other alternatives in terms of public transportation by encouraging people that you shouldn't have parking, you shouldn't have like transportation that's anything but like biking and walking by building those things that are in close proximity. And so that's like where I think it's a much more dramatic change than I think a lot of the current support is for things like ADUs. And things like converting residentials from like single units to like duplexes or fourplexes, which I don't think will go far enough given our imbalance is just so much more significant than that.
So what you would like to do then is to increase the number of businesses. I'd like to go back to a question that Susan Newman posted, and that is that we already have a 3-to-1 ratio in Palo Alto of jobs to residences. Mm-hmm. And of course that, has the effect of commuting. Right. Currently, we don't have that issue because of COVID, but obviously at some point we will go back to this. Mm-hmm. Did I understand this right? So you are for growth of businesses in Palo Alto.
Yeah.
And let me just ask you again then,
Sure.
how are we dealing with finding enough housing for those
Sure.
people who come in through this,
Yeah.
or go and solve the problems that traffic poses?
Sure. So I'll give you like an example of how I see this working. So if you look at downtown Palo Alto, which I live close by downtown, so I'm pretty familiar with it. So you have like University Avenue, and then you have like the side streets plus or minus, one street from University Avenue. So right now, if you buy land there, it's just very expensive. So if you buy, 12,000 square feet of land, it will cost, say four to $5 million. So if you build housing there, what will happen is like you would say, okay, you have 6 units, and then you want to build one additional unit. Well, that's going to have to be below market unit. And so you're pretty much like saying that if a developer fully develops that, which will probably take years to get approval from in Palo Alto, the economics are very difficult to work with the current like rental cost and the cost of like that condo. But if instead you said that the bottom floor of that property could be used for office space, all of a sudden that actually office space becomes like very, the cost of renting office space is much, much higher than the cost of renting out residential. So then you can say, okay, if you want to do this development, you can have the bottom floor be office, and in return, the top, say 3 floors have to be residential. And then in that matrix, you all of a sudden get 15 units to make the economics work from what I've seen. And this is a hypothetical example, but this is a case that I looked at. And so then you look at it as like, well, you created 1 floor of office, and then you created 15 units of housing because the economics actually work. Versus today, what happens is nothing is built there because it's just some individual rich person who's going to build a single family home in that spot. And so that's where I think that you can make the economics work, unless we want to fully subsidize below market, which I think is just an infeasible case. So I think we have to figure out like a way, like how does it like make economic sense to actually get a significant amount of housing created. And so in that case, like that's like how you'd almost like say that you get this office space in return for building this housing. And so in this example, it's like, well, there's 1 unit, but then if you have like the density and you have that, I think it's like we say, okay, what is the look back of how many people in this building are commuting to work in Palo Alto? How many are using public transportation? Like, what is the cost? And then you can implement various methods to say, if this doesn't happen, then like, what are the costs or the taxation or whatnot that's happening? But I think ultimately, you have to have housing close to work in order to prevent traffic from happening. And so that's only like where I, leave Palo Alto when I was going to work, you just see like long lines at certain areas where it was just like in the commuting direction. But interestingly enough, like when I biked to work, like traffic didn't affect me because I wasn't driving a car. And so I think this is like interestingly of like, if you're in a car, like, and not everyone else is in a car, it is going to be affect you. But if you can create a lot of like mixed use, then I think the people who want to live close, and we have great bike resources, I think we can have definitely a lot more, but then making it possible for anyone who wants to bike or walk to work, it's very feasible, which I think that from what I see is it's not necessarily the case in Palo Alto today.
So that would probably look like something like San Antonio Road.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably like the best example, but I'd say like there are a lot of other examples. Like San Antonio Road is a little, I would say like a little bit not culturally as good as like I would say like, so I think it's like a little bit more character. So like University Avenue, I think is a better example.
That University Avenue doesn't have that kind of building.
No,
That you're talking.
but I'd say if you look at like downtown North, like you have like apartment buildings there that are like higher height. So I'd say like it would be, yeah, San Antonio Road is like the closest that I would say where you do have like ground floor commercial and then top floor like office and residential.
Which would obviously change the character of
Right.
Palo Alto, but if that is your position, then
Right. And I think that that's like where I think it's like important, like depends on the area. So I don't think that should be like in a residential neighborhood. But I do feel like that areas like San Antonio Road, where it's already happening, like Palo Alto has both sides of San Antonio Road near 101. There's like a chemical plant today that takes up a significant portion of it. If you look at like 101, on the Palo Alto side, on both sides of 101, like there's a lot of like older buildings around like say Greer Park. So these are like the areas where I think it's like important. Same thing on like Page Mill Road. So I definitely think that it's important to maintain the character of like neighborhoods in Palo Alto. So I think it's like rather than like supporting something like SB 50, which I think doesn't necessarily do that, I think it's very much about like controlling growth in the right areas.
So let me jump to a question from Judith Field. She would like to know, do you live in a house or multifamily? Why did you make that choice?
So I live in a house. And for me, the reason I did that is, so I lived in Palo Alto for 10 years, and then I moved to San Francisco for 6 years, and then I moved back here. And in that time I was in the city, I had two kids. And for me, like I really wanted this opportunity to have like a front yard, a backyard, and having like the play space for kids and having like that residential feel. So for me, like that's important to me, but I have lived in, apartment buildings as well. But I think it's like depends on people at their different stages of life. And I think we need to accommodate different needs.
Let me finish off this housing topic with El Camino. As you know, there are a lot of trailers parked there. What are your ideas on how to solve that problem?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people park there because it's viewed as a safe enough place, given it's next to Stanford. There's like long areas of openness. But there have been like explorations of working with things like churches or local organizations. There's a proposal that I saw recently of using like the parking lots near Bay Shore. So I think that there are like areas that if you can view it as safe, like these unused parking lots at night or these other areas, like I think that those are better spots for that. And I think it's like you can create safe areas where people can have like their mobile homes as well without it necessarily be potentially like suboptimal areas like El Camino.
Okay, let us jump to the biggest question that we have around here in Southgate, and that is the Great Separation. Mm-hmm. Can you give us very quickly your position on that? I'm looking at a question from Inna Manga. Who would like to know what is your position on XCAT vote to close Churchill Avenue and its potential impact on traffic spillover to Embarcadero Road and other neighborhood roads that will make life dangerous for residents and kids biking to school. With Caltrain's reduced ridership and COVID impacts, do you think the city should go ahead making decisions or pause and reevaluate? So there are actually a couple of more detailed questions in there. So maybe you can.
Sure. So when I've like thought about this issue, it's looking at like the constraints that can't be changed. And so when I look at constraints, it's like, okay, there's a question of will Caltrain be electrified, like more high-speed trains, like more frequency of trains? And I don't know when that will happen, but I think that will eventually like happen. So that is like what I look at it as like an immovable constraint. If like at some point we'll have to manage this decision. There's also the question of like there's significant amount of money that has been set aside that other cities are using. And so I think there's other questions of will there be money left for Palo Alto to build things and options that cost more money. So I think it's important to look at options and make sure that we're earmarked the money that I think that would be fair for us given how much we're paying into it or the bonds and stuff. So then looking at the solutions, there's obviously been a wide range of options. And I think that the options have been presented in kind of like two ways. One is this extreme example of building a tunnel across the entire city. And when you cost that out, it's, okay, this is the high end is $4 billion. And then people say, well, this is going to cost $60,000 for every resident of Palo Alto. I think there's a lot of like fallacies with that model because the thing is looking at the extremes and it's looking at as the cost to pay it is over the course of 1 year. And the other extreme is, okay, we'll have like shoe fly tracks and we'll need to do as much property foreclosures as possible. And that'll have like a pretty negative impact on residents. So the first thing that I would look at it is I've seen studies that imply that there is an option to possibly do a tunnel for part of the city. And so basically this would look at a 2% grade. And so you need an exception for that from the 1% grade for Caltrain. But I think that that should definitely be like feasible from an engineering perspective to do. And then you say, we don't have to build a tunnel in areas where you already have solutions like University Avenue, like there's already there. And so you see, like, can we improve the solutions that we've looked at? I do think that this is a decision that's going to impact Palo Alto for like 100 years. So I don't think that the cost is as a big of an issue as like something that's like, you know, we pay it. We look at like, how do we get like bonds? How do we get other measurements? How do we get like help from, you know, these other agencies? There's obviously lots of like federal funds that are coming for public transportation as well. I think especially as like the economy like does worse and there are more issues, I think there'll be a lot more like opportunities to get federal funding for these things. I think we need to aggressively pursue that. And then I'd say like, okay, then what is the envelope of like what is possible? So then with Churchill, you know, there's solutions from like the viaduct to like the street closure. So to me, like, well, the street is open today. Like there is traffic in it today. So if there's more trains, to me, like it doesn't mean you have to close the street. It just means that the street is going to be closed for a larger percentage of time. And so I think what I read is like there might, like during peak times, there could be trains coming by like every 6 minutes or so. But I think there's a lot of things like with synchronized lights and like how long does it take the train to go by, to say like, do you have to do like a full like closure of the street? Or can it look at like other options? But I'll say like, I mean, I've seen a lot of like the debate on both sides of like what is like economically feasible. And so I would like personally like to look at some of the other alternatives, but then also with like a deadline of like making a decision around something that doesn't preclude us from getting the funding that we might need in order to create something. But I think that there are some options that clearly are infeasible, like a tunnel through the entire city, that I think that are things that aren't worthwhile to look at anymore. But I think there's some like intermediate options that are still worthwhile to explore.
So you're clearly against rethinking that tunnel option. Let me go back to a question that Abby Bradsky posed, especially in regard to the Churchill crossing. You might have answered it in a way.
Sure.
Will you base the decision of what to do mostly on XCAP's recommendation, or on what else, if not just the recommendation? So it's actually going in a little bit of a different direction. So
Yeah.
how would you value the XCAP recommendation that just came out last week?
Yeah, so I think that the recommendation, I mean, with all these recommendations, like there are lots of viewpoints that I've read that how there's like flaws in like the recommendation. And so I think like this is, it definitely at least feels like to me that there are still like options that have to be like investigated further. So I wouldn't like blindly go with the recommendation. Like I think that it would be a matter of like talking to people, and I'll be like transparent. I haven't like talked to people who live near like Churchill crossing, but I would definitely like want to get their opinion as well to see like what are the impacts. And I've read such surveys where it looks like people are pretty divided, and there are like a lot of like different opinions, of course. But I think ultimately it's like there's going to be certain immovable constraints. And I think that then it's like going to have to be worked with. So if there's only a certain amount of like, you know, if you can get $700 million and we identify that that's like the upper limit of what we can do for funding, then I think that's like the constraint of what we'd have to do. If you have to create shoe fly tracks, like what is the constraint, and like working backward from those immovable constraints.
Would you consider to put it on the ballot even?
So I think that my worry about the ballot for measures like this are, it's likely that the people who are affected by this the most will not be the majority of the city. And the majority of the city will be probably vote for whatever costs the least amount. But I think that like, one example that I have is like, so, the school system in Palo Alto, when you're giving donations, you're not giving it to an individual school, you're giving it to the city because you want like parity across the city. So I think that's like just an example where I think that we want to like make sure that we're doing the right thing for everyone in the city, and the people who are affected should have like a bigger say in decisions like this because they're going to have a bigger impact. And so voting doesn't necessarily mean you'll get the right solution for the people who are most affected by this. You'll probably get, I would view, probably the cheapest solution for the city.
Okay. So let's move on to a little bit more of economic issues. How do you want to help Palo Alto getting out of this economically difficult impact of the pandemic? And while we're talking about this, maybe you can also answer the question from Freda. What is your opinion on a proposed business tax? Could that be something that helps the budget to be a little bit fuller?
Sure. So I think that it's going to be different for different types of companies. So for small businesses, there are things that have started, like the University Ave closure, the California Avenue closure, which is like increased street traffic some, but it's not really that close to being a recovery yet. But the thing that I think is going to happen is that we need to, of course, like work as a community to get the situation under control as much as possible. So everything from like requiring face masks to the socially distant to like hand washing, like all these things are important because that helps us get into the tiers faster. So right now we recently moved into like the red zone, and like helping make sure that our community spread and our spread is down is important to just get into a place where we can actually start to reopen things. Then the story that I hear is that it is just very difficult to set up a like business in Palo Alto. So I think that a lot of the businesses that have left, I think that the reality is like, I don't think they're coming back, but I think we need to attract like new restaurants, new, like small businesses. And I think that for them, it's like, if it takes a very long time to get a permit, like if you want to go to your building and you're like, I need to change the facade, or I need to change the kitchen, or I need to go from a, like University Avenue is a great example, is probably restaurants will fare a lot better on University Avenue with a street closure than a retail. And allowing like those changes, I think is like important to move like very fast, and be like much more flexible in terms of allowing that. I think that a lot of times when we allow new businesses, like it's like the red tape is where I think is really difficult. I think we also have to do a lot of like outreach to businesses. So creating things like, empowering like the Chamber of Commerce, empowering like businesses to come up with like ideas and promotions, and encouraging them, encouraging things like, food delivery and stuff, and making that like, more accessible. So I think there's a lot of things just around just like how it's like a general like attitude and like permissibility of small businesses will be important. The other thing is, I think that there's going to be a further impact because large businesses are not in the city as well. So Palantir is leaving, Stanford is closed, and so it's like Stanford, Stanford students, Stanford faculty, like are bringing them out of business. So I think that you need to also like make sure that this office space for larger businesses is also like people come back. And so a lot of the growth for these large businesses are not looking at Palo Alto. So like Tesla is looking at building elsewhere. A lot of the large companies have publicly announced that they're looking at building outside of the area. So I think that those areas are things that like need to recover. Small businesses are going to recover. In terms of like taxation, I think that there are ballots like Prop 15, which basically that's the revocation of like Prop 13 for commercial and business uses to put them on basically market rate taxation. So the estimate for that is like that'll raise like $12 to $15 billion in California. So I think that those things, like encouraging like those taxes to like get to market rate, will be a significant driver of revenue in Palo Alto, because especially a lot of those buildings have been around for a while where people are paying very low property taxes. In terms of other things that have been proposed, like head taxes, when I look at it, is like the rationale is that a lot of larger companies aren't paying like their fair share, and so that's why like head taxes are necessary. But I think with like those large businesses, like I think that there is still a lot of benefits that they bring. Is like they bring like high-paying jobs to Palo Alto that people are then paying taxes on, that are paying, going to local businesses, like paying sales tax on. And so I think with that, like I would say that this is where I go back to, I would work with large businesses to pay us, not necessarily in this like pure taxation way, but creating public benefits in order to be allowed to continue growth. And so that's where you look at like these mixed use developments that are coming up in Mountain View and Menlo Park. And I think like that's where an opportunity is. Like you say, okay, if you're a business and you want to hire X amount of employees, you have to invest money in building housing. And obviously, it's companies like Tesla, like Google, Facebook are very wealthy, and they can definitely enable this to happen. So I look at that as like benefits, or there could be other public benefits, like whether it's like supporting development of parks or supporting development of like public transportation. Like one thing that I saw was like East Bay traffic of like you open the Dumbarton Rail up again and build a train station near East Palo Alto Menlo Park. And I think that that's the same thing as like, can you encourage like the companies to like set up their shuttles and allow, even benefits to the public on the shuttles? Like, can anyone from the public get on board these like shuttles? Things like that, I think are how I would look at larger companies.
So there has been the idea of a sales tax to fund Caltrain, the Measure RR. What is your position on that? Tying that whole topic back to the train issue.
Yeah, so I'm definitely in favor of sales taxes. Like, I think that that's like a really good way to drive revenue. I think that a lot of the businesses in Palo Alto, like say Stanford Mall and stuff like that, aren't going to move just because we have this like, center and there's a lot of benefits. There obviously big companies like Amazon and stuff are also paying sales tax as well. And so it's not just like, the shift to online moves of sales tax. I think that a fractional increase in sales tax in order to fund like the sustainability of Caltrain is a worthwhile effort. I think public transportation is like very important.
So you would actually be in favor of that, because I understand that that's currently a very hot issue, whether that tax is going towards saving Caltrain from, the COVID-19 impact.
Yeah, and I'm generally in favor of things like for transportation, things for housing, things for education, things for healthcare. Those things that I think are just strong societal and community benefits, I think are worthwhile to fund.
Mm-hmm. Let me just take one comment that Inda Monga made back to the Churchill crossing. I just wanted to read this to you.
Sure.
We would appreciate an opportunity to share our point of view on the various Churchill options and some popular viewpoints you mentioned that do not have full basis of facts underneath. Along with Churchill, please get opinions from other neighborhoods as well that are impacted.
Yep.
So maybe Inda, you can write this directly to Ajit. We'll give.
I would definitely love to hear more. I mean, I've read a lot of the newspaper articles, but I know there's a lot of different viewpoints. I'd love to always hear more viewpoints.
Yes, I thought so. So I wanted to read that question. So let me go back to another issue that is a big issue in the city. What do you propose to do about the unfunded public pension and health liability of $500 million?
Yeah, so I think with this, the first thing is seeing if there's like an opportunity to negotiate a more sustainable solution. So I think that this is like something that's actually not just affected like Palo Alto, but it's actually affected like lots of industries where you're just no longer able to provide resources anymore because you've just given these benefits that then have like ramifications 20 years, 30 years down the road. So I think that it is something that will need to be worked with. I don't think it's like necessarily fair to, and I don't even guessing it's probably not even legal to like say that, you worked in this job and you expected these like benefits. And then it's like the city is in position to move those. So I think it's like, you want to be fair to employees who worked at a job with certain expectations. But then I think like going forward, it is a question of like, well, how do you create like a more sustainable way to do this? I think a lot of this is like, well, one is, can we reduce potentially some of the costs? And when you look at the revenue for Palo Alto, you see that we make much more per like capita per citizen than most cities. Like I think for some city size, like it's like 240%. But then our expenses are something like 440%. And so we definitely spend way more than what I would say we're a wealthy city, but I think that like our expenses have like even outpaced that. So I think there's really no reason like if other cities can make the economics work, like I think that it's reasonable for us to assume that we can. And I know that like there's definitely like very high salaries. Like I've seen a lot of the public salaries, and it seems like very high to me. And so I think that there are like opportunities to revisit that and like going forward, like make adjustments. But I don't think it can be solved quickly. Like I think it's going to have to be solved over decades, unfortunately.
Okay, let me move to the issue of security. In your clip, you speak about violence against minorities happening in Palo Alto on a weekly basis, and you're advocating for police reform.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about the crimes that you're talking about and how exactly you would reform the police?
Yeah, I don't, hopefully I didn't say weekly because I don't think it's that bad.
I think you did.
Okay, so I might have to check that. But I definitely don't think it's like at that level, but I do think that there are just like systemic issues. So first of all, I'd say that I think safety is very important in Palo Alto. Like it's one of the biggest reasons that I moved here. I'd say that, I lived here for 10 years and I lived in a few other cities for a few years before moving back here. And in every one of those cities, there was some crime that happened, like whether it was my bike stolen or my computer stolen or a car broken into. And I've never had that issue in Palo Alto. And I think a lot of that it comes to is like why people want to live here because it's safe. And so I think that it's like very important to make sure that like it's the proverbial like throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think police are important. But I think that there are like systemic issues of people are, certain members of people in the community are afraid to call the police of like potentially like, the bad situations where they're just like, they don't, have a trust for the police. And we have seen that. I don't think it's weekly, but like, there are events in Palo Alto's history, even recent history, that there were lawsuits that were settled for large sums of money for like
Can you give us
over.
an example or?
Yeah, so there was basically in Barron Park, like a situation where police came in and then they were, coming in and I'd say like, I think there's like a noise complaint or an innocuous complaint. And then, there was injuries to the person because the police, got violent in that situation. And then the person like claimed it was because they were gay. And then what ended up happening is then the city settled that lawsuit for a significant amount of money. And so then you look at like that one situation that's happened, but I'd say like that's like the situation that should never happen because it didn't seem like there's any situation that should have escalated into violence in that regards. So with that, like I think that a lot of that is fear of police are afraid that like they don't know what's going to happen, and so things are like escalated. So on the police side, like I think it's a lot of like training. Like I think police are an important part, but it's like training of like, trying to go nonviolent, trying to like not use weapons, trying to not use like physical events. And if you look in a lot of other countries, it's very safe and police don't have like escalation of violence. And so I think that's like a unique sort of police culture in the US that needs to be addressed. And I think you can definitely keep people safe. Like, and there's other methods to doing that, like whether it's, things like cameras or, like coming back to, other ways in order to like help. But that's definitely like where like Palo Alto is safe because, we invest in this. And so I don't think that things like defund police and stuff that I've heard of, like, I think that those aren't the right solution. But I think like when I think about reform, it's a lot more training. Same thing with people calling the police is a lot of like the negative events were escalation for pretty minor offenses that I think could have been handled in other ways, like whether it's through community support or calling like 311 or other like non-emergency sort of services so that people know that this isn't, a dangerous event potentially. But I do feel like that that you run the risk of it's not either or, like only one side's right. Like it's important to make sure that we're safe along with addressing the fear issues that people have of police.
So Judith Peels writes, for the record, I have had my computer stolen, an intruder in my home, and the windows of my car bashed in. Maybe you overestimate PA's safety. That's just a comment from her. I would like to know, how do you define the systemic part of this issue?
Mm-hmm.
You gave us an example,
Sure.
but I live here too, and I feel like that is truly an exception to the rule. So I would like to ask you again, can you define that for me and point to where it becomes systemic?
Sure. So I think systemic isn't again, I think like some of these definitions like have changed over time in terms of like like what is like the responsibility. So I think in like the past, it was like, well, for the majority of cases, like it is fine. And so it's not like necessarily like bad things that are happening. Um, and so for what it's worth, like I haven't personally seen like examples, but then you see at least it's like one story. And like, well, should that ever like happen? And so I'd say it's maybe not like, racism in the thing, but I'd say it's like bias where people feel like they are being profiled or stopped for, whether or not it's like they've done something or they're walking on the street or someone like call them. And I think that that's like where those like incidents, like there is, the anecdotal stories of like it being in fear. And so I'd say like whether it's like prevalent or not, like I think that we should make it so that like no one is afraid to call the police and like no one is afraid of getting profiled. And I think a lot of the events, like not that they are likely to happen, like I'd say maybe there's a 99.9% chance that it won't happen. But I think that doing more like training or more sort of like recognition that like there is still more to be done is an important part of what we can do.
I can make that comment though. I mean, 99.1%, you're saying that it probably doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And on one side, and a systemic problem. These
Sure.
are very
Well,
far
but I would say like
apart.
the issue is that, I mean, just reality is like we have very few people in Palo Alto. Like I'd say like the overall like population of like African Americans is like less than 2%, I think, in Palo Alto. And so you look at it as like, well, it's not a problem because it's just it's we're not in that 2%. But I would say like if you are in the 2%, then a 0.1% problem, like well then that turns into like a 5% issue for that demographic group, which is I think unacceptable.
Right. So I read on Nextdoor once that a woman was offering to walk with people of color if they feel unsafe on the streets of Palo Alto. And I wrote to her, you know what, I'm really interested in that. Can you please tell me if people actually ask for your help?
Yeah.
And there was nothing. She
Mm-hmm.
never came back to me with anything. And I thought, maybe we are looking at this problem a little bit, we're exaggerating the problem that we have here at hand a little bit, but that is my opinion. I should move on to what others are saying here. So Abby Bratsky says, I feel that Palo Alto isn't nearly as safe as it used to be. There is some, but not a lot of violent crime, but there are almost 90 car break-ins and bike thefts. We have, from what I learned, someone here in Southgate who steals all kinds of stuff from a porch on a nightly basis and is regularly taped on Ring. Doesn't stop him. And so the police doesn't come for that, I guess.
Well, so that is what I think the police should come from. Like I do think that like things like that are like great things, is like you have Ring, you have like proof. Like it is, I think like the opportunity to like install like more videos. Like and I think I put this on my website, but like I think like videos, I think like recording, like I think that they are there. But like I definitely think for that, like that's not what is a fair situation, obviously. And so the police should do something about that. I mean, that's definitely a crime that is recorded. And I think it's like very clear evidence for that. And I think that it's like important to do those sort of things. Otherwise, like you just have like a creeping, it's like the broken window phenomena. If like the police don't do anything, then it just becomes like more and more like prevalent. It becomes like unaccepted. You hear this in San Francisco. San Francisco's a mess right now because nobody does anything. Like there's like no police who are like investigating anything. And like I've had lots of friends like, they get broken into like every week. So I definitely like feel like I'm definitely not saying like don't call the police like for crimes. Like these are clearly like crimes, like something is stolen, like things are broken into, cars are broken into. I think that those are definitely crimes that need to be looked into and need to be like resolved. I'd say like that's the view, like the goal of like police in a city.
Okay. So let me move on to a question from Susan Newman. She writes, a blog post in Palo Alto Online claims that the city manager and the city attorney have in-app whoops, inappropriate influence and control over the city's agenda.
Mhm.
I don't know what you meant there, Susan, you probably. But do you share this perception, or what do you think can be done?
So I've definitely heard this. I've definitely talked to, I think it varies a lot on city council. Like I've talked to certain people, I won't name names, but on city council who've basically told me that city council doesn't matter at all. Like it's just that the people who are running the city, like are all that matters. So it doesn't actually matter who gets elected or not, because they're trying to convince me like it doesn't actually matter like if you have one opinion or not opinion, because city staff does a lot. But then other people have told me like they call those people out and said, yeah, this person doesn't do anything. So I think it just varies. But I think that it is important that people who are elected to set the agenda for the city are influencing the city in those important decisions. Some decisions I don't think are are as relevant, that might be fine, like more like routine sort of things. But anything that's, I'd say, a significant issue or needs the time of a city or people have strong opinions on, it's important, I think, to be more active on city council than it's been in the past.
One question that didn't come up tonight, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because it was a question that got a lot of debate in the last forums. What is your position on Foothills Park? Should it be open to the public, or should it be closed, or just reserved for Palo Altans?
Sure. So my view has evolved on this. So I'll just tell you where I started. So the history of Palo Alto, like Foothills Park, is Palo Alto bought Foothills Park. And I've been there many times. I'd be honest, I think it's an okay park. I think there's better parks in the areas in Palo Alto. Like I think the Baylands I prefer. Um, but what ends up happening is like, I think that we could invest a lot in that park to make it a lot better. Like I think like restocking of fish is something that I really want to do. But then the problem is that it turned from an issue of whether or not Palo Alto should have that open or not to Palo Alto is not being like inclusive. My honest, I feel, is that if we open it up, the people who are going to come there are people from Menlo Park, Atherton, Portola Valley that are no, like it's like someone's not going to come from, I'd say probably East Palo Alto and pay an entrance fee to get access to Foothills Park. So I think that a lot of like the issues have been like tied up like incorrectly in terms of like, what is the park representative of? But I think that the reality is, perception becomes reality. And so this is like turned into this issue that it makes like Palo Alto look pretty bad, I think, that it's not open. So I don't actually think that people come broad. So the way I would sort of say like, well, how do you reconcile these two different things? Let's say that, okay, well, we should determine like, what is the appropriate number of people who can come to the park? And so I've read that was like 1,000, a long time ago to like, now like I think 470 people come on average per day to the park. So I think it's like, what is the sustainable amount to make sure that the park has the resources? And then I think there's some number of people that you allow in, and then you can collect those fees to improve upon the park. And so it's this balance of making sure that Palo Alto isn't footing the bill, but then also using like being able to say it's open. And so there's other areas, like I think San Mateo has done this in one of the parks. But I think it's like now you have to strike a balance of it's not just the reality of the situation, but it's also like managing the perception of what people have as well, and making sure that Palo Alto isn't looked at as being inclusive. But what I'd like to fix is like, I don't think that opening up Foothills is going to fix diversity problems in Palo Alto at all. Like, I just think that that's totally unrealistic. Hopefully we can make Palo Alto more diverse. And then those people also have the benefit of going to Foothills Park. Like that's ideally like what I'd like, but it's difficult now given how the issue has been framed.
I like your phrase, perception becomes reality. I'm going to use that in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we only have 6 more minutes, and it is custom that we give you a couple of minutes to give us a little elevator speech. I would like to finish with 2 questions. Number one, for the sake of transparency, who supports you? Are you taking any funds from anyone, or how do you finance your campaign?
Yeah, so I right now I'm self-financing my campaign. I have been offered donations, but I have not accepted any yet. I haven't made a final decision yet, but I likely will just self-finance my entire campaign.
Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have any cash sitting around?
Well, yeah, so there's definitely there. I mean, but the thing is, like, I think it's like a real question of like, well, what is the obligation for someone who is, giving money? And like the thing for me, like I was like, I've been lucky enough to make enough money that I don't need to take donations. Like I can self-fund the campaign myself, but I also like don't want it to be unfair as well. And so like and this is just like thinking that I've like thought is, I've thought like maybe I'll self-finance the campaign, but I won't spend more than the person who's raised the least amount of money. Because I feel like that might be a balance of like, if I self-finance and I spend a lot of money, then it'll be viewed as like, well, that's just buying the election. But then if I self-finance and I don't have any outside interests, but then I just fund the same amount as the person who's raised the least amount of money. And I felt that that's probably the fairest way to do it. That's currently what I'm thinking, but
That's a very interesting viewpoint. I like that actually. So to finish off from my side, before I hand over to you, if you could pick who sits on city council with you of your competitors, who would you pick?
So that's a tough question. Like I've gone back and forth a lot on that, but I do think it's like important to have a council that's representative of the viewpoints of the city. Like I do think that like the council has to work together, but I don't believe in like partisanship. And so like when I look at the council, like the person I talk to the most that I think is like a pretty good viewpoints is I like Greg Tanaka. I think that he's like supporting viewpoints. I think everybody has pros and cons. I like Carrie Templeton. I think Carrie Templeton has like some great views. I think she's like also like moderated and like willing to work with people. And then I really like the historical work that Pat Burt has done on the council as well. So it's definitely not just like all one viewpoint, but I'd say like I'm looking at like people I think are capable in different areas. And I'd say like those are the people I think bring a broad set of skills.
Well, thank you very much. You have exactly 2 minutes to tell us a little bit more why you would like us to vote for you, as opposed to Pat, Carrie, and Greg.
Sure. So I'd say that I believe that Palo Alto has so much to offer. Like I moved here because I love Palo Alto. I have like 2 young kids, they're 3 and 5. Like I want to make sure that they stay in Palo Alto, like for their lives and that they can grow. And so to me, like I'm really thinking of like, how does Palo Alto like create opportunities for everyone and becoming this like, center of Silicon Valley, center of innovation. So I really look at it as like, I come from like a tech background, and it's like the sort of situation that I got by coming to Palo Alto, I want to ensure that other people have as well. And so that's kind of like, if you, I guess, believe in Palo Alto, sort of like continuing on this trajectory and increasing that, that's what I'm in favor of.
And if you would like to give us your website where people could go to if they want to support you.
Sure, it's yeah, so it's www.ajitvarma.org. And if you have any comments, definitely appreciate feedback. And I think all these things are like helping me like just like understand a lot of like the subtleties and different viewpoints, rather than being in like sort of a bubble myself with other people who are just in like tech, for instance, or my neighbors. So definitely appreciate the opportunity here from you.
Ajit, thank you very much for taking the time tonight to be with us. We wish you lots of luck for your campaign, and let's see whether we see you with Greg, Carrie, and Pat on City Council very soon. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.